It was a quiet summer evening, the kind of evening where everything felt perfect. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the backyard. A gentle breeze ruffled the leaves of the trees, and the smell of sizzling steak wafted through the air. Laughter echoed from the family gathered around the grill, a father, his children, and their close friends, all enjoying a peaceful barbecue. There was nothing out of the ordinary about this evening. It was just another weekend get-together, a moment of joy in a life filled with hard work and small pleasures. But then, the wail of sirens broke through the evening calm, instantly cutting through the peaceful atmosphere. It wasn't long before flashing blue lights reflected off the windows, causing a ripple of confusion among the family members. The father, who had just flipped another steak on the grill, looked up in disbelief. His children paused mid-laughter, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The officers were here, 2 patrol cars had pulled up in front of the house. "Is everything okay?" his wife asked, her voice laced with concern as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "I'm not sure," the father muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Let me go see." He turned toward the officers, already stepping out of their vehicles and making their way toward the porch. "Sir, we received a call about noise complaints from the neighbor next door." "Are you aware of the disturbance?" one of the officers asked, his tone polite but firm. The father blinked, stunned. Noise complaints? From their neighbor? He couldn't believe it. There had been no shouting, no blaring music, no rowdy behavior. It was just a simple, family barbecue. The smell of the food still lingered in the air, and the laughter of his children could still be heard faintly. This didn't make sense. But then, his mind froze for a moment. He remembered his recent promotion. Just a few days ago, he had been named the new police chief of the city. It had been a proud moment for him, a culmination of years of hard work. But now, standing in front of these officers, he wondered if this promotion was going to complicate things. Was this what his new role would bring, scrutiny even in his personal life? I didn't think we were being loud," the father said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We're just having a quiet dinner. The kids were playing, but that's about it." The officer gave a tight nod but didn't look convinced. "We're just here to follow up on the call, sir," he said. "We'll need to talk to your neighbor and see if they still want to proceed with the complaint." Before the father could respond, his neighbor appeared at the edge of the driveway. The two exchanged a glance, one that was both familiar and unsettling. The father had always gotten along with the neighbor. They had waved hello on countless mornings, chatted during neighborhood events, and even helped each other out when something needed fixing. But now, there was something different in the neighbor's eyes. A look of coldness, perhaps even a trace of resentment. "Is there a problem?" the father asked, his voice calm but now tinged with confusion. "The noise is disturbing," the neighbor replied, his voice flat. "I asked you nicely to keep it down before, but nothing's changed. It's getting out of hand." The father's mind raced. He had never thought of his BBQs as a source of disturbance. But what bothered him more than the accusation was the strange detachment in his neighbor's tone. There was no warmth, no hint of the friendly relationship they once shared. Was this just a complaint about noise, or was there something more to it? "I'm sorry if we disturbed you," the father said, trying to remain diplomatic. "But I don't think it's that bad. Maybe we can talk about it inside? I'm sure we can work something out." The neighbor didn't respond right away. He seemed to hesitate, as though wrestling with his own emotions. Finally, he shook his head and turned back toward his house without saying another word. As the officers glanced at each other, the father couldn't help but wonder what had caused the sudden change in his neighbor's behavior. The situation felt so out of place, so unlike anything he had ever experienced in his quiet, suburban life. And yet, here he was, standing in front of police officers with his own neighbor acting as if he had just committed some unforgivable crime. "All right, thank you for your time, sir," one of the officers said before turning to leave. "We'll handle it from here." The father stood there for a moment, feeling a strange knot tighten in his stomach. Was this just a minor inconvenience, or was something more at play? His career, his family, his community, all of it had been built on trust. But now, with the call from the police ringing in his ears, that trust felt fragile, uncertain. He had always believed that he could handle anything life threw his way, but this? This was different. With a sigh, he turned back to the grill, trying to shake off the unease. His family was waiting for him. The steaks weren't going to cook themselves. But as he looked around at the quiet evening, a new thought settled in his mind. This wasn't just about a simple barbecue. There was something deeper here. Something that he had yet to fully understand. And as the sun set, casting long shadows over the yard, he realized that his life was about to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. The father stood for a moment, watching the patrol cars disappear down the street, feeling the weight of the encounter settle over him. He returned to the grill, where the steaks had started to blacken slightly at the edges. His wife looked at him with concern, sensing that something deeper was troubling him. The children, once full of laughter, were now quiet. Their eyes flicked between their father and the fence that separated their home from the neighbor's yard. He turned the steaks quickly, trying to regain his composure, but his mind wouldn't settle. He wondered why the neighbor, someone he'd always believed to be fair and kind, would do this. It was more than just a noise complaint. Something was bothering the neighbor, and the father couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden reason behind the call. He thought about his recent promotion as the new police chief. Could his new position have somehow changed things between them, even before he'd had a chance to announce it? The family tried to resume their meal, but the cheerful atmosphere was gone. Everyone could sense the unease hanging in the air. The father glanced around the yard, remembering happier times when the neighbor would join their cookouts, even offering to bring fresh lemonade or help man the grill. Those days seemed distant now. Instead of hearing friendly conversation over the fence, he heard only the dull hum of traffic on the street beyond. The father's wife placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and asked him quietly if everything was all right. He forced a reassuring smile and nodded, but he knew she could see through him. He took a seat at the picnic table and tried to focus on the meal. The children poked at their plates, stealing nervous glances toward the neighbor's house. The father knew he had to address their concerns. "Well," he said softly, trying to sound calm, "sometimes neighbors have their reasons. Maybe he wasn't feeling well, or maybe he's got something on his mind." He paused, trying to reassure himself as much as them. "Don't worry. We'll figure it out." He spoke these words, but inside he felt a growing tension. He didn't want to escalate the situation. It was just a noise complaint, after all. But he also couldn't ignore the possibility that the neighbor's actions were a sign of deeper resentment. He recalled conversations from the past few weeks, passing remarks about the father's dedication to his job, hints that he would soon have more responsibility in the community. Maybe the neighbor already knew about his promotion. Rumors spread fast in small neighborhoods. If so, why would that lead to such an unfriendly call? After dinner, as the twilight deepened, the father walked around the side of the house to take out the trash. The neighbor's yard was dark, only a small light near the back door illuminating a patch of lawn. He thought about calling out a friendly greeting, but his words stuck in his throat. The tension was too fresh, the sense of betrayal too strong. Back inside, he put the dishes in the sink and rinsed them, trying to distract himself with the mundane task. The house was quieter than usual. The children had gone upstairs to play, and his wife was tidying the living room. He could still feel the uncomfortable energy lingering in the air. It clung to him like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. Sitting down at the kitchen table, he found himself replaying the scene in his head, the neighbor's cold stare, the patrol car's flashing lights, the officer's polite but firm approach. It all felt surreal, as if it had happened in a dream. But it was very real. He thought about the public nature of his new position. Being a police chief wouldn't just mean making decisions for the city's department, it also meant he would be more visible, his family's life more scrutinized. Was this incident just a hint of what might come? Could others try to provoke a reaction from him now that he was in a position of authority? He remembered one of the officer's expressions of mild confusion, as if the entire call was an overreaction. Even they had seemed uncertain about the validity of the complaint. Still, they had to follow procedure. In truth, he respected that. He himself had followed similar protocols countless times. But it hurt to be on the receiving end of such suspicion, especially from a neighbor he had once trusted. His wife joined him at the table, placing a mug of tea in front of him. He thanked her quietly, resting his hands around the warm ceramic. The two shared a look, one that said they would face this challenge together. Even though it was just one neighbor's phone call, it felt like a crack in the peaceful life they'd built. "How do you want to handle this?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. He let out a long sigh before replying, "I'm not sure yet. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but at the same time, I can't ignore that something's changed. Maybe I should talk to him, try to see if something else is bothering him." She nodded, her eyes reflecting both worry and faith in her husband's ability to resolve conflict. He sipped his tea, the mild taste bringing him a small measure of comfort. He thought back to all the times he'd mediated disagreements in the community, disputes over property lines, parking spots, noisy pets. He'd always believed in peaceful solutions, in talking things out. Yet this was different. It was personal. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, he stepped outside again. The moon was high, casting a silver glow over the yard. Shadows stretched across the fence, hinting at the darkness that lay on the other side. He couldn't see any lights on in the neighbors' windows. The house looked empty, as if nobody lived there. He stood there, remembering the sirens, the flashing lights, and the neighbors' accusing stare. A chill ran through him despite the mild summer air. He took a deep breath, resolving to get to the bottom of this, quietly, diplomatically, but firmly. The last thing he wanted was an ongoing feud. He had seen too many small misunderstandings escalate into bigger problems. Above all, he wanted to preserve the peace for his family and the neighborhood he cherished. As he walked back into the house, he felt a mixture of determination and apprehension. Tomorrow, he would try to speak with the neighbor, perhaps extend a hand in friendship or offer a chance to discuss whatever was bothering him. Yet, the father couldn't ignore the lingering thought that there might be something much deeper at play, something beyond the typical neighborly disputes. One thing was certain, the comfortable, predictable rhythm of their suburban life had shifted. He didn't know how the conversation would go, or if it would even be welcomed, but he had to try. Because if there was one thing he had learned through years of serving his community, it was that misunderstandings rarely solve themselves. And if he was going to succeed as both a father and a leader, he needed to face this challenge head-on, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. He climbed the stairs, turning off the lights behind him. With each step, he felt the tension settling deeper into his bones, bracing him for what lay ahead. Early the next morning, the father awoke earlier than usual, his mind already racing with thoughts about the previous evening. He tried to shake off the tension by going through his normal routine. He made coffee, fed the dog, and quietly looked out the window at the neighbor's house. The yard next door was still, curtains drawn, no signs of life. He found himself wondering if maybe he had blown the situation out of proportion. But then he remembered the calm determination in the neighbor's voice, and the unspoken hostility that had hung in the air. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and planning his day. Later, he would have to stop by the police station for an orientation related to his new position. He still hadn't officially gone public with his promotion to police chief, only a select few officers and local officials knew. This was standard procedure, a sort of transitional period before the formal announcement was made. He thought about the irony. Here he was, a soon-to-be police chief, dealing with a petty noise complaint at his own home. The idea made him chuckle wryly, though the humor quickly faded into a sense of unease. His wife joined him at the table, placing a reassuring hand over his. She didn't say anything at first, but her eyes expressed the same concern he felt. Finally, she broke the silence. "Maybe you could try to talk to him later today," she said gently, referring to the neighbor. "You've always been good at resolving conflicts. Why not take the initiative?" He nodded slowly, considering her suggestion. Approaching the neighbor wasn't just about clearing the air, it was also about understanding why someone he once considered friendly would suddenly call the police. If there was resentment or some misunderstanding, he wanted to get to the bottom of it. But a part of him worried that confronting the neighbor too soon might make things worse. After breakfast, he drove to the police station. On the way, his thoughts kept drifting back to the backyard scene, the flashing lights, the polite but firm officers, the neighbor's stony stare. It felt surreal, like a scene from someone else's life. Turning onto the main road, he tried to refocus on the day's responsibilities. The station was bustling with activity when he arrived. Officers in uniform moved about, discussing assignments and sharing the usual morning chatter. A few recognized him immediately and offered congratulatory nods, well aware of his impending promotion. Inside a small conference room, he met briefly with an official from the city council, who provided him with an outline of his upcoming responsibilities. He would soon oversee policy changes, manage budgets, and serve as a liaison between law enforcement and the community. While the father was honored to be entrusted with such a role, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. He knew that being police chief would bring increased visibility. If a minor noise complaint at his home was already making him uneasy, what other personal challenges might arise when everyone learned of his promotion? As he wrapped up the meeting, he considered asking one of the officers about the noise complaint from the night before. However, he decided against it for the moment. Part of him wanted to keep the matter private and handle it personally. He sensed that if more people at the station found out, it could become gossip or, worse, a public spectacle. He preferred a quiet resolution, if possible. Heading back to his car, he tried to think of what he would say to the neighbor. Should he knock on the door and calmly ask if there was something else bothering him? Or should he wait and see if the neighbor reached out first? The father mulled over these questions, feeling the same uncertainty he had experienced the night before. By midday, he was back home, the sun high in the sky, the warmth of summer pressing in on the neighborhood. The father decided that the best course of action might be a friendly knock on the neighbor's door, a simple request to chat. No accusations, no blaming, just an attempt to understand. If the neighbor refused, then at least he would have tried. If the neighbor opened up, maybe they could settle any differences before they spiraled out of control. He changed into more casual clothes and made his way over. Standing on the neighbor's porch, he noticed the chipped paint on the railings and the worn welcome mat, small details he hadn't paid attention to before. They seemed to speak of someone who might have more going on in life than he let on, some stress or struggle that had been easy to hide during friendly waves across the fence. Taking a deep breath, the father raised his hand to knock, but there was no response. The house was silent, as though no one was home. After a few moments, he slowly lowered his hand. With a sigh, he turned away, feeling both relief and frustration. He couldn't force a conversation with someone who wasn't there. Perhaps the neighbor was at work or out running errands. Maybe he was intentionally avoiding the father. The questions only added to his growing sense of mystery. Walking back to his own yard, the father noticed the grill still in its place from the night before, remnants of charred food on the grates. The memory of laughter and sizzling steak felt distant, replaced by this new tension he couldn't quite name. He felt a stab of regret that what should have been a simple night of family bonding had taken such a turn. As the afternoon wore on, he tried to keep busy. He tidied the garage, checked the mail, and helped his children with small chores around the house. Yet every so often, he found himself glancing toward the neighbor's property, searching for any sign of movement behind the curtains or in the driveway. A part of him wanted to see some indication that everything was normal, that his neighbor might step outside and greet him like before. But the house remained silent. Later, he tried to focus on planning his transition into the police chief position. He sat in his home office, looking at paperwork and thinking about the core values he wanted to bring to the role: transparency, fairness, and a genuine desire to serve the community. How ironic, he thought, that his first challenge was unfolding right outside his own home. If he couldn't handle a misunderstanding with a neighbor, how would he manage bigger issues in the city? He shook his head, determined not to let self-doubt take over. He reminded himself that this was just one moment in time, one hurdle to clear. He would give the neighbor space for a day or two, then try again. Meanwhile, he would carry on with his responsibilities and keep his family's spirits high. Life was full of unexpected twists, and he trusted that open communication and a level head would guide him through this, just as they had guided him throughout his career. Yet a nagging thought lingered: the neighbor's attitude, the phone call to the police, and that strange expression on his face. Was there a deeper reason behind it all? The father couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was more significant than it appeared. Though he hoped for a peaceful resolution, a quiet voice inside him warned that he needed to prepare for something more. A single complaint could be the tip of an iceberg, the first sign of tensions he never knew existed. If that was true, then talking alone might not be enough. That evening, as he sat down to dinner with his family, the father wore a smile and tried to keep the conversation light. He didn't want to burden them with his worries. Yet inside, he remained unsettled, committed to finding answers but uncertain of what he would discover once he did. And as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across their yard, he made a silent promise to himself: he would address this issue carefully, honestly, and with a sense of compassion, for his neighbor, for his family, and for the community he was soon to lead. The father spent much of the night turning from one side to the other, unable to find rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured his neighbor's distant stare and heard the echo of sirens. By dawn, he felt weary but more determined. There had to be a reason for the neighbor's sudden hostility, and he refused to let confusion or fear cloud his judgment. After a quick breakfast, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He often did this when he needed to clear his mind, and it also gave him a chance to connect with other residents. The father felt a warm wave of recognition as he passed familiar houses, each with a story of its own. A few neighbors waved from their porches, greeting him with friendly smiles. He waved back, wondering if any of them knew what had happened the other night. He stopped to chat with an older man who lived across the street, an individual known for tending to the community's shared garden. The father asked if he had noticed anything unusual lately. The older man shook his head, saying everything seemed normal. He did mention that he'd heard sirens a few days ago but hadn't thought much of it. The father didn't reveal the details, only thanked him and continued on his way. Further down the block, he passed a house where a woman often babysat her grandkids. She sat on her porch, sipping tea. Curious about neighborhood gossip, the father approached her gently. She hadn't heard about any recent disputes, other than a few mild complaints about barking dogs or overgrown hedges. She laughed lightly, recalling that the neighbor in question had always seemed polite enough but rarely attended community events. She asked if everything was okay. The father simply replied that he was looking into a small misunderstanding. He thanked her for her time and moved on. Although he got no direct clues, the casual conversations reminded him that most people in this area genuinely cared about one another. The father felt a sense of unity lingering in the air, and that comforted him. He wondered why his neighbor had chosen a different path. Could there be personal problems he was dealing with, a recent loss, or an issue that had worn him down? Perhaps the neighbor had let those feelings build up until they surfaced as anger toward the simplest things, like a harmless family barbecue. Returning home, the father noticed the neighbor's car pulling into the driveway. His heart rate quickened at the opportunity to talk face to face. He walked over, careful to keep his body language open and friendly. As he reached the fence, he saw the neighbor step out of the car, carrying a small stack of mail. The father raised a hand in greeting. For a moment, the neighbor looked as though he might turn away, but then he offered a stiff nod. "Hey," the father called in a calm voice. "I saw you come home and wanted to see if we could talk for a minute." The neighbor paused, gripping the mail a bit too tightly. "I'm busy," came the reply. His voice had an edge, but it wasn't outright hostile. "I need to sort a few things out." The father felt a pang of disappointment but didn't push. "Sure," he said, making a small gesture of understanding. "If you have some time later, please let me know. I'd really appreciate a chance to clear things up." The neighbor's gaze flickered toward him, then toward the house. "Maybe later," he finally muttered, before disappearing inside. It wasn't much, but the father interpreted it as a tiny opening. At least the neighbor hadn't outright refused. He lingered by the fence a moment, listening to the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. A cautious hope flickered in his mind. Something was clearly bothering the neighbor, and while the father didn't have all the answers yet, he believed communication could help. Taking a deep breath, he walked back to his own house, deciding to give the neighbor space for now. Inside, his wife asked if he'd had any luck. He explained the brief exchange, noticing her worried expression. She urged him to keep trying but also to take care of his own well-being. Their family had enough to handle with his upcoming responsibilities. Stressing about this situation wouldn't help, she reminded him gently. He decided to bury himself in some house projects for the afternoon. He fixed a squeaky window in one of the bedrooms and organized a hallway closet that had been neglected for months. Focusing on small, productive tasks kept his mind busy, but every so often, thoughts of the neighbor returned. He recalled his experiences in law enforcement, how many disputes he had resolved by listening, understanding, and offering patience. Perhaps that approach would work here too, but only if the neighbor allowed it. Later, while preparing an early dinner, the father heard a knock on the door. His heart jolted. He exchanged a glance with his wife before opening the door and finding the neighbor standing there, hands in his pockets. The man looked uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Can we talk?" the neighbor asked, voice low. "Sure," the father said, stepping outside onto the porch. He noticed the neighbor wasn't making eye contact. There was a strained pause, the air thick with tension. The father gently broke the silence. "I appreciate you coming over. This whole thing has been weighing on me, and I'd like to make sure we're on good terms if possible." The neighbor let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's not that simple," he murmured. "I've been dealing with, well, a lot. And the noise the other night was just the last thing I needed." The father leaned against the porch railing, nodding calmly. "I get it. But you caught me off guard with the police call. I'm sure you had your reasons, though." The neighbor looked torn between annoyance and sorrow. He finally glanced at the father, his voice subdued. "I lost my job recently. It was unexpected, and I've been on edge. Then I heard your family out there, laughing and celebrating, and it just hit me hard. I guess I snapped." The father felt a wave of sympathy. He remembered times in his own life when stress had nearly consumed him, though he'd never made a drastic move like calling the cops on a neighbor. "I'm sorry about your job," he said gently. "It must be tough. If there's anything I can do, let me know." The neighbor looked down at his feet, reluctant to accept any help. Yet a faint hint of relief crossed his features. "I appreciate it. I don't want pity." No pity, the father replied, shaking his head. Just understanding. And maybe we can figure out how to avoid something like this from happening again. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The neighbor shifted uncomfortably, as though struggling to decide how much to share. In that stillness, the father sensed that the tension might not dissolve overnight. But at least they were speaking. Eventually, the neighbor cleared his throat. Look, I have some things to sort out, but I'm not trying to be the enemy here. I know I overreacted. Just, keep it down next time, okay? The father offered a small smile, accepting the partial truce. Of course. If it bothers you, please just let me know before it gets out of hand. The neighbor nodded, turning to go. As he walked away, he hesitated, then glanced back. His face was still guarded, but there was a trace of warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Thanks, he said simply, and then he disappeared down the steps. Left alone on the porch, the father exhaled, feeling a cautious hope. This confrontation had shed some light on the neighbor's situation. Clearly, he was under pressure, and the father couldn't blame him for feeling overwhelmed. Yet he also wondered if there was even more beneath the surface. Losing a job was painful, but would it alone lead someone to call the police on a friendly cookout? Maybe there were other worries or resentments simmering as well. Stepping back inside, the father looked at his wife and children. They were peeking around the corner, unsure if it was safe to come forward. He offered a reassuring nod and joined them, ready to share what had happened. Though the conversation with the neighbor had been tense, it felt like a tiny step in the right direction. He only hoped it was enough to prevent any future conflicts, and that it might open the door to true understanding in the days to come. Later that evening, the father sat quietly on the porch, his gaze fixed on the starry sky. The conversation with his neighbor had gone better than expected, but it still felt like there was something more left unsaid. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that might take more time to unfold. But for now, he had at least removed the sharpest edges of the tension. It was a small victory, one that felt satisfying in the moment, yet he knew it wasn't over. As he sat there, his wife joined him, bringing out a glass of lemonade. She sat beside him, and for a few moments, they didn't speak. The sounds of crickets chirping filled the air, and the evening felt almost peaceful again, though the earlier events lingered like a shadow over their home. "You did good today," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, full of reassurance. "You gave him the chance to explain, to open up. That's more than most would do." He nodded, but the unease still gnawed at him. "I just can't help but feel there's more going on. Why did he call the cops? Why not come over and talk to me directly? He's clearly dealing with something, but I don't know. It feels like there's more he's not telling me." She placed her hand over his, offering a small but comforting squeeze. "Maybe he'll open up more in time. You gave him that opportunity, and it sounds like he's not looking to escalate things further. That's a good sign." He wanted to believe her. He truly did. But something about the neighbor's demeanor, that coldness in his eyes, still bothered him. Could it really be as simple as a noise complaint? Was it only stress from losing his job, or was there something deeper that had been festering between them all along? The father leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about the community he had worked so hard to build, the ideals of cooperation and understanding that he had spent years fighting for in his career. Wasn't that the goal of a police officer? To mediate, to listen, to resolve conflicts? But when it came to his own life, his own family, how easy was it to follow that same advice? The balance between being a good neighbor and a good officer was harder than he'd realized. "I think you're right," he said eventually, his voice soft. "But I can't help but wonder if there's something more. Maybe I should try talking to him again, just to see if there's anything else he wants to say." His wife looked at him thoughtfully before nodding. If you feel that's what's best, then do it. But don't overdo it. Let him come to you when he's ready. And remember, sometimes people just need time to heal. You can't force that. The father leaned back in his chair, the warm breeze brushing against his face. Her words made sense. Time had a way of sorting things out, of allowing wounds to heal before they could be fully understood. But part of him was still unsatisfied, still wondering what had driven his neighbor to act the way he had. I guess I'm just worried about the future, he admitted, looking down at his hands. If this is how a simple misunderstanding can spiral, what's it going to be like when I start working full-time at the station? What if people start looking at me differently, waiting for me to mess up? What if there are more calls like this, small things turning into big problems? His wife gave him a gentle smile, sensing the weight of his thoughts. You've got this, she said softly. You're strong. You've faced challenges before, and you've always handled them with grace. The job doesn't change who you are. People will look up to you, not because of your title, but because of your heart. He smiled back, grateful for her support. She had always been his rock, the steady force that kept him grounded. Even when things seemed uncertain, she reminded him that the values he believed in, respect, kindness, fairness, would always guide him, both as a father and as a leader. The next day passed in a blur of normal activities, work calls, errands, and small conversations with neighbors and family. Yet, the events from the night before continued to circle in the back of his mind. The father knew that the issue wasn't over, it had simply been paused. By the afternoon, he decided to take one more step. He went out to mow the lawn, hoping the neighbor might be outside as well. As he pushed the mower along, he noticed the neighbor's car parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of movement inside. The quiet tension lingered in the air like a weight, pressing down on the father's thoughts. Just as he was finishing up the front yard, the neighbor stepped outside. This time, he didn't seem as guarded. His shoulders were relaxed, and his eyes weren't filled with the same intensity as before. It was a subtle change, but it was enough for the father to take a step forward. "Hey, there," the father called out, wiping his hands on his pants. "Got a minute?" The neighbor hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, I've got a few minutes. What's on your mind?" The father smiled, feeling the tension lift slightly. "I was thinking we could have a coffee sometime. Just to talk. I'd like to know how you're doing. If you ever feel like talking, I'm here." The neighbor stood for a moment, looking down at the ground. There was a long pause, and for a second, the father thought he might turn away. But then, slowly, the neighbor nodded. "Yeah, I think that'd be good," he said quietly. It's been a rough time. A lot of things happening all at once. I didn't handle it well." The father felt a wave of relief wash over him. There it was, the opening he had been hoping for. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him know that, maybe, just maybe, the neighbor was ready to rebuild some trust. "I understand," the father said, his voice warm. "And we'll take it one step at a time. No pressure." The neighbor smiled faintly, looking more human than he had in days. "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind." The father nodded and walked back to his house, feeling a small but significant weight lift off his shoulders. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a while, he felt like things could improve. Maybe, just maybe, this small conversation would lead to something bigger, a new beginning for both of them. As he stepped back into the house, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The challenge wasn't over, but he knew that, together, they could navigate it, one conversation at a time. The following days felt like a slow unraveling of tension, each interaction with his neighbor becoming slightly less strained. The father was careful not to push too hard, giving the neighbor the space he needed to work through whatever was bothering him. They exchanged polite greetings when their paths crossed, but each time the father felt a small shift, like a veil of discomfort being lifted bit by bit. One afternoon, about a week after their last conversation, the father was out in the front yard, fixing a fence that had been knocked loose by a storm. He was focused on the task, his hands working steadily, when he heard footsteps behind him. He looked up to see the neighbor walking down his driveway, a coffee cup in hand. "Hey," the neighbor said, offering a slight smile. "Thought I'd bring you something." The father paused, surprised but grateful. "That's really kind of you." "Thanks." The neighbor hesitated, glancing at the fence and then back at the father. "I was thinking about what you said, about having coffee. Maybe we could sit down and talk." The father's heart lifted. He had been waiting for this moment, and now it was finally here. "I'd like that," he said, putting down his tools and wiping his hands on a rag. "Let's sit on the porch." They both made their way to the father's porch, where the father quickly set up 2 chairs and invited the neighbor to sit. It felt like the beginning of something more, a conversation that wasn't rushed or forced, just 2 people willing to listen and understand each other. As they sat down, the neighbor took a sip of his coffee and set the cup down with a soft clink. For a moment, the 2 men just sat in silence, the soft rustle of the trees and distant sounds of neighborhood life filling the quiet. The father could sense the hesitation still in the air, but there was also a shift, something that suggested the neighbor was ready to open up, to break the silence that had built up between them over the years. Finally, the neighbor spoke. "I know I didn't handle things well when I called the police on your barbecue. It wasn't about the noise. It was something personal." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I've been going through a tough time. Lost my job, and everything just seemed to pile up. I felt like I was losing control, and then I heard all the laughter from your backyard, and it just hit me in a way I didn't expect. I didn't know who else to turn to, so I called the cops." The father listened quietly, his gaze softening. He could see the weight in the neighbor's words, the shame that lingered in his voice. He could also sense the vulnerability, a part of the neighbor that had been buried beneath layers of frustration and fear. "I didn't realize," the father said gently. "That's a lot to carry. I can only imagine how overwhelming it must have been to feel like everything was falling apart." The neighbor nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Yeah. It's been hard. It's not just the job loss, either. I've got a lot of things at home I'm dealing with too, family stuff, personal stuff. And it just felt like nothing was going right. But it wasn't fair of me to take it out on you or your family." The father thought about his own life, his own struggles, the times when he had felt like the weight of the world was too much to bear. He thought about the many times he had needed someone to talk to, someone to understand. He also thought about the importance of community, of being there for each other, especially when times were tough. "You don't have to apologize," the father said, his voice calm but firm. "I understand more than you think. We all go through hard times, and sometimes it feels like it's too much to handle. But we're neighbors, and we're all in this together. If you ever need to talk, or if you need help with anything, I'm here." The neighbor looked at him, a mixture of relief and gratitude in his eyes. "I didn't expect you to say that," he admitted. "I thought you'd be angry, or that you'd think I was just trying to cause trouble. But hearing you say that, it means a lot." The father smiled, feeling the heaviness of the situation begin to lift. "There's no point in holding on to anger. Life's too short for that. We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them and keep moving forward." There was a long pause as the neighbor took another sip of coffee, nodding thoughtfully. "I've been thinking a lot about that, too," he said finally. "About how I've let things build up until I snapped. I've been isolating myself, pushing people away. I don't want to keep doing that. Maybe it's time I let go of some of this resentment. It's not helping me, and it's certainly not helping anyone around me." The father nodded, recognizing the strength it took to admit that. You don't have to carry all of that on your own. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to lean on others when things get tough. The neighbor smiled faintly, a look of relief crossing his face. I guess I never really thought about it like that. Maybe I've been too proud, or too afraid of what people might think. But I'm starting to realize that it doesn't have to be like that. I can ask for help when I need it. The father leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. This conversation was everything he had hoped it would be, an opportunity to rebuild trust, to offer understanding, and to create a space where both men could admit their struggles without fear of judgment. We all need a little help now and then, the father said with a smile. And you don't have to face everything alone. We're all part of the same community, and that means we're here for each other. Always. The neighbor's smile deepened, and for the first time in a while, he seemed at peace. Thanks, he said quietly. I really appreciate it. Maybe this whole thing wasn't as much of a disaster as I thought. The father chuckled softly, nodding. It certainly hasn't been easy, but I think we're on the right track. As the afternoon wore on, the two men continued to talk, sharing stories and experiences, things they had never discussed before, but things that had brought them closer in understanding. The father realized that while their relationship may have been strained in the past, this moment marked the beginning of something new, a foundation for a better connection, built on honesty and empathy. When the conversation came to an end, the neighbor stood up, stretching his legs. I'll let you get back to your day, he said, his voice lighter than it had been in days. But thanks again. This really helped. The father stood as well, extending his hand. Anytime. And remember, if you ever need anything, just come by. The neighbor shook his hand firmly, a sign of respect and acknowledgement. I will. Thanks, really. As the neighbor walked back to his house, the father stood on the porch for a moment, reflecting on everything they had discussed. It wasn't just about clearing up a misunderstanding, it was about rebuilding a relationship, about finding common ground despite the challenges. And in that moment, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the resolution, but for the opportunity to make a real difference in someone's life. As he went inside to join his family, he knew that life wasn't always going to be smooth. But with understanding, patience, and a willingness to listen, even the toughest situations could be transformed. And that, he realized, was the true power of community. The days that followed were quieter, yet filled with a new sense of understanding. The father found himself reflecting on the events of the past week, on the conversations, the emotional moments, and the small victories that had shaped everything. The neighbor, once a stranger to him in many ways, had become someone he could rely on, not just as a neighbor but as a fellow human being navigating his own struggles. They had crossed paths many times before, but now, for the first time, they truly saw each other for who they were, flawed, vulnerable, and ultimately, connected by the same desires for peace, understanding, and community. Over the next few weeks, the father noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. The neighbor, who had once kept to himself, started to attend neighborhood events again, offering to help with local projects. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was a start. And that small start was all it took to break the cycle of isolation and resentment. As he spent more time with his family, the father began to realize that the true value of his promotion to police chief wasn't just about authority or responsibility, it was about leading by example, showing kindness, and being a steady hand when things got difficult. His role was more than about enforcing laws, it was about inspiring the very values that made a community strong. At the next neighborhood barbecue, there was an unspoken understanding between the father and his neighbor. They both knew that things hadn't been easy, but now, standing side by the grill, they were simply two men trying to create a better world, one small act of kindness at a time. There were no more awkward silences, no more resentments, just the sounds of laughter, the sizzle of meat on the grill, and the warmth of family and friends gathered together. As the evening wore on, the father found himself standing at the edge of the yard, looking out at the gathering before him. His wife and children were laughing, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become like family. The world felt whole again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. He had learned so much in these past few weeks, lessons that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Life wasn't always predictable. It was full of moments of confusion, misunderstanding, and frustration. But what mattered most wasn't how perfect everything was, but how people handled the challenges they faced. The father had faced his own doubts, his own fears, and had stepped into the unknown. But he had learned one simple truth, that the best way to lead, to be a good neighbor, a good father, and a good person, was to listen, to understand, and to never give up on the people who mattered. He turned back to the barbecue, joining his family and neighbors. They were talking about everything and nothing all at once, lost in the warmth of their shared connection. The father smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons life had taught him. He knew that he would face more challenges in the future, more misunderstandings, more tough decisions, but he also knew that as long as he kept this one truth in his heart, everything else would fall into place. In the end, it wasn't the job, or the title, or even the titles of neighbor or police chief that mattered. It was the connection between people, the simple act of reaching out, understanding each other's struggles, and working together for the greater good. And as the night continued, with the laughter of children and the warmth of friendship filling the air, the father knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning.